Morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock, time for the inquiry to resume. I just want, first of all, to just say a few words about the programme in view of where we are at the end, towards the end of week one. I've been looking at the timetable which was circulated, and I've just got some suggestions for adjustments. You may want to come back on this later today, but my thought today, clearly, I want to devote to flood risk and hopefully deal with that topic. Next week, just in effect moving on in the sequence that we've got. I see Tuesday for ecology, Wednesday morning for the personal evidence of the appellants, and then Wednesday afternoon and Thursday morning for the planning witnesses, followed on Thursday afternoon by the conditions roundtable. Friday then, site visits in the morning and closing submissions to end in the afternoon. There is just one caveat to that, which is that you may recall that yesterday Councillor Watson requested when he could speak, and I did commit to this afternoon for him. So irrespective of the fact that we may still be in the middle of flood risk evidence, I will hear Councillor Watterson when he arrives this afternoon. Thanks, Mr. Masters. That's helpful. So those are my thoughts at the moment. If there's any difficulties for any of the witnesses, if people could let me know before the end of today, and then I'll endeavour to get the office to send out a revised timetable for Monday. There's one point of detail that I just wanted to alert the planning witnesses to for when they give their evidence. They may well recall that in a document from Hascombe Parish Council, I'll give you the CD reference, it's CD 5A.2, and it predates the appeal, I think. I think it's their response to the planning application, or one of the planning applications. But they do make comments about concern about the effect on heritage assets at the original thatched house farm. And clearly, as they've made a specific, I know I fully appreciate it's not a main issue, but nevertheless, it's been raised by a party, and I think we'll need to address that. So I want to give the planning witnesses the opportunity to comment on it, and I'll be asking for their comments in due course. And finally, just a word about evidence, which may particularly apply to this topic. Chance it may come up in something else as well. Prompted really by, I think it was something I heard Mr. Cottle say about land outside the sites. Clearly, I'm content to allow discussion by parties, by witnesses from either side, and matters relevant to their subject area, which are already before the inquiry, whether or not they've introduced it or the party opposing them has introduced it. But if there are matters that are not currently in evidence before the inquiry, they shouldn't really be introduced at this stage, either in evidence or in cross-examination. There's a risk of prejudice to the other party. Having said that, and I've already said this to the advocates, I do need to have information that is relevant to every party's case. So if there is likelihood of new material, but there's also a concern about fairness because this is recent material, if it's relevant, I think the only way forward would be that I would need a new proof on that matter, and there would need to be the opportunity to recall witnesses. I don't want new materials going into new areas that aren't at all before the inquiry. So I hope that makes sense. Mr. Cottle, is there anything you need to raise?
openly to alert more my learned friend and yourself that Mr. Jarman gave evidence as to his understanding of Section 226 being repealed, and I was putting forward Section 8 as now containing what Section 226 used to say, because of amendment by the Housing and Planning Act 2016, Section 214. And I will be producing a copy of Section 8,
Yes.
which imposes the duty on housing authorities to assess the accommodation needs of those residing and resorting to their district in caravans.
So you're not saying Mr. Jarman was wrong about
He was
Section
correct in saying that 226 has been repealed,
Yes.
but he was wrong in saying that Section 8 doesn't contain the duty.
Yes, yeah. Okay, was there anything else, Mr. Goddell?
Well, I did discover in the planning, in the appellant's statement of case, one of the photographs from the injunction, which showed the site before the, certainly my client
yes.
appealed B. And there is also a photograph, I believe, in the ecology evidence that shows the site that's now got the 33 statics on it, which the local residents and certainly my client's cases was the planning permission was never implemented.
Have you noted down references for those?
I haven't got the exact references to hand, but just to reassure you that those photographs are in the bundle before you, and you will be referred to them when Mr. Woods gives his evidence.
Okay, yeah, as long as they're helpful if I have the references. Thank you. Mr. Masters, do you have anything you'd like to raise?
Yes. Sorry, Mr. Smythe in his evidence.
Yes.
Uses new service water mapping.
Yes, I think this was in the supplementary, wasn't it?
Yeah. So I think it'd be very useful for you to have the guidance note produced by the EA in relation to that mapping. So I've got 4 copies here, which I'll hand out.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Mr. Masters. Thank you for that, Mr. Masters. I'll put that on the pile of documents. Was there anything else you wish to raise now?
No, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Linton?
No, nothing from us, Inspector. We're all ready to go.
Okay, well, carry on then with introduce Mr. Smythe, please.
Thank you very much. So, Inspector, the approach that I'm going to take with Mr. Smythe is to ask him to introduce himself by reading his experience, and then I'm going to ask him to read through his summary in Section 6 and just update it in relation to the new mapping so that you've got those references in there. It will only take a few minutes to read that section. And then I'm going to concentrate, Inspector, on 3 topics that have crystallised through the evidence as what I will call the main issues of dispute. And those are the first topic being the sequential test. And I'm going to go through with him whether it should be applied, the new flood maps, and then the engagement and search criteria that are involved within that process in relation to site size, allocated sites, etc. So that's the first issue. And then the next issue is the exception test. And again, whether it should be applied. And then the 2 elements which he will be dealing with, which is making flood risk worse elsewhere and safety. So there'll be those 2 issues within that second topic. And then the third topic, Inspector, is whether that can be dealt with or addressed by condition. And I'll go through the 3 elements that are raised by my learned friends, witnesses, what I've called 1, the appropriate pipe in inverted commas solution that Mr. Woods discusses. Appropriate pipe which is the way he puts it in his 957. And then the basin, in inverted commas, solution. And then finally, what Mr. Rowe talks about, infiltration.
Can I just add, sir, that we did have a discussion as to whether or not a different condition would be put forward by the appellants before Mr. Lintott was at this stage of introducing his evidence, because the D would be in terms of reinstating the watercourse, which is a different condition, and it's in the pipeline, and we'd had hoped to have it yesterday and printed off before everybody went home. But there will be a point this morning where there will be a new condition, and it is part of our case, and the experts discussed it but were unable to agree it. A condition that goes wider than a pipe, a basin, or infiltration.
Inspector, this engages directly with your first point this morning as to whether or not you're content to allow additional information. Obviously, we will talk with anybody that comes to talk with us. Mr. Smythe's view, as you'll hear, is that there is no solution that's possible. The idea of reinstating the entire watercourse, which isn't raised in any of the evidence, and would have a whole raft of difficulties associated with it in terms of, well, you've already identified what the plans you've got, no blue line areas that cover additional land. Mr. Smythe will deal with that under his third topic, but just to be absolutely clear, the local authority objects to further information being put in on those matters. It's not agreed it can be dealt with by those matters, and procedurally, it is wholly inappropriate to raise a completely different solution which would have major ramifications for all of these sites at this stage in the inquiry. So I just state what the local authority's position is on that.
So my position is slightly nuanced, and so I understand it. My position is that, but what we need is a drainage scheme. The details of the scheme is something to be agreed between the councils at an appropriate stage. That might involve a scheme that's a Grampian scheme to cover land outside the ownership. And that might involve, for instance, the scheme may involve all sorts of things, but that would be something for the scheme to be examined under the scheme at the appropriate time, and we don't need to go into the detail of it at the moment. And so I'm not introducing anything new, because our case has always been that this can be dealt with properly by a condition of a drainage scheme.
Just add, sir, that it is about a planning condition. We are going to have a session on planning conditions. So if we're not allowed to bring it up now, we'll obviously bring it up in the planning conditions session. It would have been sensible, Mr. Smythe here, whether he's going to be here for the condition session, I don't know. But parties are encouraged to look at conditions on a without prejudice basis. And we're putting forward potential solutions as planning conditions. So it seems to be entirely
yes, but my point earlier, Mr. Woods, and now, is that parties need to be aware of the likely content and scope of that condition. At the moment, I've heard what Mr. Cottle said, something beyond what's been talked about already. I've absolutely no idea what's envisaged,
well,
and if there is a completely new type of scheme that's envisaged, I don't think it's sufficient to say that and just leave it to conditions. Apart from the other party, it's unfair as far as I'm concerned. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Exactly. So it is wrong that this witness doesn't get an opportunity of dealing with it in his evidence. And I think the purpose of me raising the point has been achieved by Mr. Lintott telling you that he is going to ask Mr. Smythe about the reinstatement of the watercourse. And then it would be for you to decide, as Mr. Masters and Mr. Woods has suggested, as to whether that's a reasonable and viable option. Also, the witness knows exactly what we're talking about because they had a discussion about it and were unable to agree.
Well, I have no knowledge of that. Certainly, I'm not aware of anything other than what you said this morning.
It's a matter of fairness to Mr. Smythe that he has an opportunity to deal with that.
Yeah, that's right. At the moment, I haven't seen any draft condition or any plans yet.
No, so Mr. Smythe has had a detailed conversation for over an hour, I think, with Tom Quigg about that as a solution, that wasn't the only solution put forward, by the way.
Which is what you encouraged, so you said outside
Okay.
the inquiry.
Of course, yes.
So Mr. Quigg is fully aware of the details, and there is no new point because it's been explained between the experts outside court.
So if we get to a stage where we've got to the last limb of my learned friend's examination of chief, perhaps we could then adjourn and then you could have a copy of the condition, Mr. Smythe could have a copy of the condition, and we can carry on at that stage.
Well, I'm prepared to review it, but my point remains that if there is something new and it's relevant and there's a risk of unfairness, I'm not necessarily going to proceed with hearing about it today. Okay. Right, Mr. Lintop.
Thank you, Inspector. So, Inspector, if I can then proceed by asking, now, I suppose before I do that, just so that you can easily find the relevant documents, I'll just run through what I'll principally be asking the witness to refer to. It's pretty much what you would expect. So he's obviously submitted a main proof, and he's submitted a rebuttal proof and a summary proof. So there's those three documents. You've obviously got Mr. Wood's proof and Mr. Wood's appendices, and also there are some references within Mr. Rowe's evidence to the drainage. So that's all taken as read. For your reference, the two flooding reports in the evidence, you've got them separate. So there's those two. There's also the, wherever you've got it, just have to hand the latest copy of the MPPF, and also the case that my learned friend handed up on day one that you've got as ID 11, and that's the case of our substation action save East Suffolk Limited. So just make sure you've got that to hand, because I'm going to ask the witness to refer to that too. Fantastic. And of course, Mr. Masters has just handed up the guidance notes, and you'll see within those he's underlined a section. The pages aren't numbered, but if you flick through, you'll see he's put an asterisk at the bottom under suitability and conditions, and he's underlined some wording on the next page ahead of how to access them. So I will be asking the witness to just address that when we come to the relevant section of his evidence. So I don't know if you've got that to hand, but that's yeah, no, well, I'm the same on that. Okay, so if we go then to your main proof then, Mr. Smythe. Mr. Smythe, is it Mr. Smythe or Mr. Smith?
Smythe.
Smythe, it is Smythe, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. You seemed a little bit unsure. Okay, good. So Mr. Smythe, if we could just have your scope of evidence, if you could just read out the 1.1 to 1.6 of that to start with.
Absolutely. This proof of evidence has been prepared by myself, Mark Smythe, and I'm representing Waverley Borough Council. I'm a chartered member of the Institute of Civil Engineers. I achieved chartership in 2007, and I'm registered with the Engineering Council to operate as a chartered engineer. Before that, I held a degree in environmental engineering, and I've got over 25 years experience in civil engineering and environmental engineering, including flood risk and drainage. I've operated generally across the south and southeast of England, and my experience has covered all types of development, residential, recreational, commercial, and I've worked for both public and private sector clients. I'm currently a director of Stuart Michael Associates, which is a private consultancy practice in Thatcham in Berkshire. And in that organisation, I lead the drainage or environmental team, and we specialise in flood risk, drainage design, hydraulic modelling and other environmental services. The team that I lead in that organisation regularly produce flood risk assessments associated with all types of development. Prior to this role, I was working at a nuclear facility, and on that facility, I had a role within the design authority as a civil engineer, drainage engineer, and that was a license requirement of the nuclear site to be of a certain level of expertise in those disciplines.
Thank you very much. So then you could turn to the final section in your main proof of evidence on page 55, where you've got summary and conclusions. And my experience is it's just 5 pages long. It's quicker just to ask you to read that. But as you will have heard me say to the inspector, I'd like you, just where you talk about the flood mapping, to just update the inspector with where we are now following your supplemental evidence, please.
Absolutely. And so as I've said, I've introduced myself. The proof is obviously putting the case forward for Waverley Borough Council, and it's looking at all 4 appeal sites, A, B, C and D. And I'll start with surface water flood risk. So the Environment Agency have produced surface water flood mapping that's been compared with the location of these development sites. And the extent of flooding is shown on the Appendix A plan within my supplemental evidence.
So should we, where you've said Appendix 3 in 6.4, should the inspector now note that the updated evidence is in your Appendix A of the supplemental proof?
That's correct, yeah.
And just for your note, Inspector, the supplemental proof is at CD 10A to D, and then Little Roman 1.4. Okay.
Thank
So
you.
if we can then recommence from 6.5.
So due to the changing landform associated with this development, the topography has been changed and the risk of surface water flooding will have increased due to the reduction in capacity of the watercourse. And when reviewing the flood maps, it's worth noting that because of that land raising and the features of the development, the extent of flooding is likely worse than that shown in Appendix A of my flood supplemental information. And these modifications, so the culverting, the land raising, the earthworks associated with the development platforms, because of these, we can't accurately determine the extent of flood risk associated with this development. And we can also not say that flood risk hasn't increased elsewhere, which within my supplemental proof and rebuttal information, I show that it has. So the presented information doesn't take account of climate change, and this is a requirement of local plan policy CC4, which was referenced in the refusal information. And the need for the climate change allowance is also referenced in the NPPF.
And
So
then you make a point at 6.7 about the 1 in 1,000 year event surface water flood extent can be used as a proxy for the 1 in 100 year event, including climate change allowances. Perhaps if you go to 6.8 and say, well, what's the situation now in relation to the supplemental evidence Appendix A and what that shows by updating us when you read that paragraph out.
Should we just get that appendix out?
Yep.
Yeah. So, Inspector, while you're finding that, you'll see that we've got it in Appendix A, and then the witness has also helpfully.
It's in the statement, isn't it?
Yeah, he's dropped it in.
I think it's page
Yeah.
6 and 7. I can
that'd be
compare
easier.
the new flood maps or the current flood maps
Yeah,
with the historic
that's going to be quicker.
flood maps. So if you were to look at,
Yeah.
oh, it's pages 6 and 7.
I've got it, thank you.
In figure 1, that shows the new flood maps. relative to the red line boundaries associated with A, B, C, and D. The high risk is shown by the darkest blue. There is effectively it's quite hard to see, but there's a medium blue and then there's a very light blue. The medium represents the medium risk of surface water flooding. The light blue shows the low risk. And within my chief today, I'll kind of expand on those points. But what can clearly be seen from these current flood maps is that there is high risk of surface water flooding across large parts of each of these development sites.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smythe. Well, I think probably then, if you go to 6.11 and just read through the beginning of that section then, please.
Just before you do, Mr. Smythe, can you just put some numbers on what high risk means?
So high risk in terms of probability or likelihood means the 1 in 30-year rainfall event. The medium risk means the 1 in 100-year rainfall event. And the low risk means the 1 in 1,000.
Thank you.
And then perhaps in terms of, because you're going to deal with this later in your evidence, equating those to zones 1, 2 and 3, where would high risk come in respect of that categorisation?
So if you were reading across between the probability associated with surface water and with river flooding, 3B is the highest risk, which is 1 in 30, described as a functional floodplain. And that's, like I say, 3B. 3A is the 1 in 100 year, which is represented by the medium. Zone 2 is represented by the 1 in 1,000, which is shown by the light blue on the surface water maps. And then anything outside of that is considered to be very low, and that's referred to as zone 1 when talking about rivers, coastal. But in terms of surface water flooding, that's referred to as very low.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so 6.11 then, please.
So the sequential approach directs the more vulnerable usage of a site away from the areas most at risk from flooding. These sites propose development that is highly vulnerable, and I'd just like to draw the inspector's attention to the definition of that. So within the back of the MPPF, under Annex 3, the document's titled Flood Risk Vulnerability Classification. And there are 5 categories here. The first one, essential infrastructure. The second is highly vulnerable. And it's worth noting that under the fourth bullet there, caravans, mobile homes and park homes that are intended for residential use are categorised as highly vulnerable.
Now, we'll obviously come back to the sequential test as part of your first topic in the evidence, but could you just read then 6.12 so we've got just an overview of what your conclusions are before focusing on those issues. So just read that through.
The development has not been demonstrated that the site adequately considers the sequential test, which must consider all sources of flooding, including surface water and groundwater. This is a requirement of the MPPF, the PPG, and the local plan CC4, as I mentioned, was a reason for refusal. And this has been reiterated by several planning inspector decisions.
Okay, and what about 6.13 then?
So it's worth noting the sort of on the flood maps that these correspond with the route of an ordinary watercourse. So this ordinary watercourse hasn't been named by the Environment Agency, but what it does do is it drains a a catchment of land located to the west of the site, where there's a pond up by Thatch House Farm. It flows down a small valley and it conveys water through appeal sites A, B, and then C and D, noting that C and D sites include an area of site boundary that runs south from the area of the caravans, along the Lydia Park access track, and connects with Stovolds Hill.
Okay, and so if you can just read 6.14 then, please.
So, but before the development, so effectively the baseline, the pre-development baseline, this watercourse was open, it was free flowing, it could accept the drainage from the west, it flowed towards the east, and it was an open watercourse located on the north side of the Lydia Park access track. The development works have led to the infilling and the closure of that watercourse, and it is being replaced with a piped culvert instead, which now accepts the flows from the west and conveys the water flow towards the east in the direction of the Cobbler's Brook.
Mr. Smythe, when you say that the watercourse has been infilled and closed, does that mean that the culvert's in a different place, or is it running along the line of the watercourse?
It's hard to say from the information. It's approximately on the alignment of the old watercourse. And it's worth saying, within my proof of evidence, I think it's one of the latter appendices, I undertake a calculation to assess the flow capacity of an open watercourse. And then I compare that to the size of a pipe, which I believe is being used instead of the open watercourse. And it's worth saying that there's a...
Excellent. So you've given us that in 6.14, and you explain that your Appendix 11 reduces the capacity by an order of 91%, the calculation you've done there. And you also refer to the planning framework inspector for your note. In 8.14, we've got an old paragraph number 173. So that's now 181.
Yes.
And you explain there that requires planning authorities to ensure flood risk isn't increased elsewhere. Can you then start?
Mr. Lintott, sorry,
Yeah,
just
of course.
for completeness on 6.14, in terms of what you've told me about the culvert, so is it one section of culvert from A through to the access to C and D, or is it any sections relating to the appeal sites as I've got them with the red lines?
It's quite hard to say, but what I did, as shown in my proof, is I visited the site in July of last year before I produced my information. And during that visit, I was able to have a look down a drainage manhole or chamber, and then I could clearly see that a pipe had been installed. It was on the alignment of the watercourse, and it looked like it was taking flows from the west to the east. What I haven't been able to do is access the land to the west of appeal site A and visually confirm there is a head wall or a pipe inlet to the west of the application sites, but it to me appears there is, and I've produced my information on the basis that there is a pipe through there.
But on the east side of A, in terms of the appeal sites, I've then got a gap to B, and then similarly there's a gap from B
I
to
believe there's a pipe in the ground there, but I haven't evidence.
So you're not sure if it's one or three?
Like I said, I believe there's a pipe from the far side of A.
Yes.
All the way through under the respective red
Okay,
lines.
well, I'll ask the appellants in due course.
So I can confirm there are, those are my instructions, and that's the evidence.
It's
my
a single
clients-
pipe.
There are pipes through. And for the main watercourse that was filled in, there's a single long pipe.
Okay, well, we'll get onto that in due course. Thanks, Mr. Masters. Thanks, Mr. Smythe.
Excellent. So we've got down to the bottom of 6.14. So can you just read through 6.15 and 6.16 then?
Yeah, so the appeal site A has impeded the flow of water, and a pond has been formed on the upstream side of appeal site A on land outside the applicant's control. The modification of this watercourse has increased flood risk outside the development, as evidenced by the off-site flooding. And I believe the development should be dismissed on this basis. It's noted that all the appeal sites, A through to D, are accessed via the north of Lydia Park, the access track on a east-west alignment from the appeal sites towards Stovolds Hill. And that the drainage outfall for this location has been impeded, and consequently surface water flood risk has increased in the neighbouring locations. And it's worth noting that the neighbouring locations are also caravans and park homes, which are also classified as highly vulnerable in terms of flood risk.
Okay, and so next section then, 6.17.
Safe access and emergency. So these aspects are kind of fundamental to drainage and flood risk. So safe access and egress, noting there is surface water flood risk across, and it's high risk across all the sites. It hasn't been shown within the information presented to me that this has been addressed and that safe access could be provided. Such consideration requires us to consider future occupants and how they will safely enter and leave, and also how emergency services could fundamentally access these development areas in event of an emergency during a situation of flooding.
6.19.
The modification of the watercourse and these increased areas of hard standing associated with these four developments has also increased flood risk to the surrounding area.
And you've changed may to has also there. Is that a deliberate change based upon the mapping? So do you say it may increase, or do you say it has actually increased?
I say it has increased, and I think the supplemental evidence clearly shows that.
Okay, and then do you want to move on and just read 6.20 then and 6.21?
So surface water design, so 6.20 and 21 is talking about appropriate design. So there's a SUDS manual, the Syria C73, and that requires schemes to provide treatment and attenuation of surface water on new developments. And information within the application FRAs hasn't demonstrated this, and it's not been shown that these could be feasibly provided by this development. The lack of the SUDS measures, as per the Syria guidance, do not provide confidence that the development can support SUDS design and SUDS measures. The developments include a high degree of hard standing, where vehicles are manoeuvring and parking, and a SUDS treatment function should be shown to address these features of the development. These heavily paved areas restrict the ability of rainfall to enter into the ground and result in a fact where the rainfall flows over the surface rather than sinking into the ground, which increases flood risk, and also means flows are discharged in an untreated and unprocessed way into the downstream drainage networks.
So if you just remind us then of your bulleted points as to, given the vulnerability classification you've described, associated flood risk, what are those issues, those bulleted issues that you conclude on then in terms of the appeal
In
side?
summary of the blue, so these sites are located in an area of risk of surface water flooding. And it includes features of the development which significantly alter the way surface water flood occurs on these sites. The information doesn't accurately define the post-development surface water flood extent for the site. And it doesn't quantify the extent of flooding relative to the developments. The scheme has modified and impeded the flow of the established watercourse. This is contrary to the procedures set by the council within the ordinary watercourse process, and also contrary to the Land Drainage Act 1991. The infilling of the watercourse has also removed drainage provision for the Lydia Park access track, thus impeding surface water draining from the neighbouring area. I see no information that addresses the impact of climate change for surface water, which one would normally expect. The information doesn't demonstrate safe access and egress during a surface water flood event. And it has increased flooding elsewhere through the formation of a pond and the closure of the watercourse. And without this information, it's not possible to establish the level of increased risk, the danger to life, risk to property, or harm that has occurred as a result of infilling the local watercourse, and the risk increase associated with the imposed on the surrounding community as part of that, through the development as it stands, which is noted as being unconsented.
Thank you very much. So, Inspector, then if we can move to my first topic, which is the sequential test. And what I would like you to do is to have in front of you the ID 11 Court of Appeal judgment, and also section of the NPPF that deals with flood risk. So that's the section that begins on page 48, 14, meeting the challenge of climate change, and in particular, the section that is entitled Planning and Flood Risk from section, paragraph 170 onwards. So have those two documents in front of you. Inspector, I'm going to ask the witness to address this first part of the sequential test, well, whether the sequential test should be done. And I want you to have a look at, to start with, the ID 11 document, and I want you to help us with that document, and to start with, what version of the NPPF was in place when their lordships were looking at the issue for this case. And I will just remind you that in terms of the case, Inspector, you can see there in the held note, interested parties applied for development consent orders under section 114 of the 2008 Act to authorise nationally significant infrastructure projects consisting of 2 proposed offshore wind farms with associated onshore and offshore development. That's the first line. At the bottom G, we can see that the judge had dismissed the claim, holding that it was a matter of judgment for an applicant and ultimately the decision maker as how flood risks from surface water ought to be dealt with. And if you turn over the page onto 562, you can see in the held note that they were considering overarching policy EN1 and the NPPF. And under B, the ratio is that you can see there nothing in those policies required an applicant for development consent to demonstrate that there was no alternative site reasonably available with a lower risk of surface water flooding, i.e. the sequential test. So to start with, can I ask you to turn then please to paragraph 8 of that judgment, and in paragraph 8 on page 567, we can see there that we've got the paragraphs that were in place at the time of that judgment. Starting please under G, we've got 162. And what I would like you to do is to compare 162 with its where that policy now appears in the NPPF 174, and help the inspector with any material differences as you see it.
So within section 8, we've got a quote, effectively repetition of the old MPBF 162, which steers us towards the aim of the sequential test, which is to steer development to areas at the lowest risk of flooding from any source. Development should not be allocated or permitted if there are reasonably viable sites appropriate for the proposed development in areas at lower risk of flooding. The strategic flood risk assessment will provide the basis for applying this. The sequential approach should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding.
Now, pausing there, those lines, the sequential approach should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in future from any form of flooding. Can you have a look at page 50 of the current NPPF and paragraph 174, which is the paragraph looking at the aim of the sequential test to steer new development? And one can see there that the wording continues as per 162, but after we get to applying this test, we see that the words, the sequential approach, should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding. That's been omitted from 174, hasn't it? Is that correct?
That's correct. So that area has been, that sentence at the end of the old 162 has now been removed to clarify the aim.
Now, within the judgment, we see 163 is then quoted. If it's not possible for development to be located in areas with a low risk of flooding, the sequential test may have to be applied. And we can see on page 51 of the NPPF that that corresponds to paragraph 177. So we've got a gap between those two paragraphs where in the new NPPF, we've got some more paragraphs inserted. And can you please help the inspector by reading to him paragraph 175, and then we'll go on and look at the ratio.
Yeah, so paragraph 175, as you've been informed, has been added, and that was added in December of last year. And the reason for the addition of that was industry confusion associated with particularly this substation ruling. There was another Red Road case around the same time, and there was uncertainty about how industry would deal with sequential test and sequential approach. So the addition of 175 is a direct result of that confusion and clarifies for the industry how the sequential test should be used. So now I'll just read it now. So the sequential test should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding, except in circumstances where a site-specific flood risk assessment demonstrates that no built development within the site boundary, including access and escape routes, land raising, or other potentially vulnerable elements would be located in an area that would be at risk of flooding from any source, now and in the future, having regard to potential changes in flood risk.
So asking you, Inspector, to keep in your mind the opening words there, the sequential test should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding, and the absence of those words at the bottom of 162 on page 567 talking about the sequential approach should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding. Can we turn forward, please, to the ratio of that decision where we see Lord Justice Lewis's comments and decision at 43 on page 583 of that decision. So turn please to 583 and 43.
Yeah,
And
so
then
halfway through,
when you're there, yeah, if you would, you can see it says, picks up paragraph 162 again, 5 lines down. So I'd like you to start from the at paragraph 162, please.
So at paragraph 162, the framework recognises the aim of the sequential test is to steer new development to areas with the lowest risk of flooding from any source, and also refers to development not being allowed or permitted if there are reasonably available sites in areas with lower risk of flooding. This is a reference to the sequential test as defined in EN1 and is applicable to areas subject to fluvial flooding. The final sentence in paragraph 162 deals with flood risk more generally and refers to the sequential approach being used in areas known to be at risk of flooding from any form.
And so pausing there for a moment, that final sentence, is that the sentence that has been removed from 174 or not?
That's the sentence that's being removed in the most recent update of the planning framework.
So then just continue reading, please, for the next 3 lines.
The final sentence of
Yeah, from
Yeah,
the
yeah.
provisions of the, because you'd read
the provisions of the framework do not, however, require an applicant for development consent to demonstrate that there are no other sites reasonably available if any part of the development is to be located in areas where there's a risk of flooding from surface water.
Now, can I ask you to stop there and just remind the inspector what the first sentence of 175 now says in relation to whether there is now a requirement?
So the first sentence of 175 clearly outlines that flood risk must be considered now or in the future. So dealing with future scenarios, climate change, and also any form of flooding. And that includes, for clarity, surface water flooding.
And so where it now says the sequential test should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding, is that material in terms of what we see there at the top of page 584, which says the development does not require an applicant for consent to demonstrate there are no other sites reasonably available?
Absolutely. So that is a new clear way of dealing with the sequential test. And like I said, I think this came out in January, from January to December of last year, there was a lot of confusion in the industry about how we dealt with the sequential test, how we deal with surface water flood risk. That uncertainty is being removed in the new update of the MPPF, where 175 clearly mandates how this is dealt with.
Now, Mr. Woods, in fairness to him, accepts that a sequential test should be done, and he lays that out in his proof how he's done that. In terms of the second issue, Inspector, the new flood mapping, we've touched on that to a degree in just reading through the summary. So you've already had an introduction to what those maps are. So my second issue, the new flood maps, it has really been in part addressed. But could I just ask you to help the inspector, obviously, with Mr. Wood's sequential test assessment, when that was taken, and how that relates to the current position in terms of your description of there now being high risk flooding across all the sites?
So, so Mr. Woods produced, as part of a rebuttal pack, a sequential test as part of his proof of evidence. I've got the CD number here, if that would be helpful for everyone. I think it's CD 7A.2. So it's worth noting that this assessment was undertaken against the old surface water flood maps, which are now out of date and withdrawn. The sites A to D now have high risk surface water flooding across all of them. The previous maps, which Mr. Woods assessed, showed low and medium risk across the site. So the extent of flooding is now shown to be more severe in the current maps. And those maps are included in my supplemental information under Appendix A.
So that's the extent of shown by the dark.
Yes, so the extent of high risk is the darkest of the 3 blues on that plan.
Thank you very much. And so, so you've introduced that mapping, and we've looked at pages 6 and 7 and the appendix. Can I just ask you then, in terms of that new mapping, can you help us with those current maps and what they demonstrate? So what are they based upon? You described them in your rebuttal proof, but I want you to help the inspector with what he can draw from them.
Yeah, sure. So at the end of January in 2025, this year, the Environment Agency produced a major update to their surface water flood maps. So this was a national update. The old flood maps were produced based on information from, I believe, 2013. So the new flood mapping is produced off the latest national topographic survey in the form of a LiDAR from 2019. For the new mapping, yeah. So I note that's, yes. So that's the last time. So the LiDAR is an aircraft mounted radar system. That's the last time there was a national kind of flyover that the Environment Agency have used as a topographical digital terrain model to run their flood mapping software tools. So it's worth also noting the Environment Agency say this is a new, more advanced modelling exercise. So not only does it use updated ground modelling information, it also updates rainfall patterns. It draws on historical flood information, and it enhances where there's locally produced flood models by the lead local flood authorities. So all these new and updated data sets are used with newer and more advanced modelling techniques to produce the new Environment Agency maps.
Yes, and we see that map on page 6 of your
That's right, and it's
supplementary.
If you compare it to page 7.
Yeah,
So it's worth noting that the page 7 map is showing kind of a wide area of low risk.
and this is a narrower area,
Yeah.
I think. But
And that's precisely that. So because the new mapping is using a finer grid
yes,
of levels, the new mapping has obviously picked up the watercourse as it existed in 2019.
and
and
you said that the high risk is I think represents a 1 in 30-year
That's correct.
rainfall event. What I'd like to know is what does that mean on the ground if you're in it's an area of high risk in terms of depth of water, in terms of
Probably
flow?
600, so 2 foot, 600 mil or deeper, but
Sorry, 600 mil.
so 0.6 of a metre.
Yeah,
But it may be more. It may, at local level, it could be up to 900 mil. My learned friend has passed around some information. I think there's some depth information in that guidance that's just been circulated.
right. Well, no doubt we'll get to that in due course. But that would be a range, would it, in a high risk surface water area? 600 to 900.
Yeah, it'd be at least 600 across there.
And would high risk indicate a certain type level of flow, speed of flow?
No, and it's worth saying that. So the old Environment Agency flood maps dealt with a kind of allowed hazard to be drawn from that information. So it included velocity information.
Yes.
The new flood maps don't have any velocity information in them. So the only thing that's provided is the depth of the flood water.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So then can we just have a look then, please, at the FRA that's been provided by Flume at CD2A.5.
So it's worth noting kind of within all this flood information from the FRAs, my proof, there's kind of 3 presentations of flood information. The old flood maps and what we've got here on that's a figure 8 of the Flume report, and I'll just get to that. It's some information presented entitled Flood Map 4, which is produced by Arbonental, dated 2023. So that organisation's, I think, now been taken over by Royal Haskoni. Page 8, within the Flume report, there's some information on the old surface water maps, but there's also some additional information presented, which is figure 8.
So it's introduced, Inspector, on page 8, where you see it describes the UK flood map 4 in the second paragraph on page 8, and then there are some figures after that, and a couple of pages on, there's a figure on page 11 that purports to show the site, because of course we're dealing with site A here, free from surface water flooding. So that's the figure that we're looking at. And so what I would like you to do is help us then, please, given the description that we see on page 10, for example, where the flood map 4 and the EA maps are compared. Can you help us with what flood map 4 does, compare it to the latest mapping that you've just described? And I want you also to finish by helping us with what the recent flooding event in November demonstrates, in your view, as to which the inspector should be placing most reliance on.
Yeah, thank you. So, as we see on page 10 and 11, there's an assessment of the surface water flood model suitabilities there, and underneath that, there's a comment regarding suitability. Within that, it notes that the EA flood models tend to perform better on sites that are steeper and rural in nature than flat urban areas. And this flood map 4 tool is something that I use within my organisation. I find that its use is a bit limited. It does benefit from data sets from insurance companies. So in urban areas where the insurers have records of where flooding occurred, extra information can be drawn upon to produce a level of confidence in the information. But I don't feel that this is appropriate for this site. And like I said, within the Flume report, it accepts that the EA mapping is well suited to steeper rural sites. The other thing, and there are 3 points that I take issue with this map, is that the flood map 4 doesn't clearly show to me, as the reviewer, the ground level for which a flooding event is being considered. Though it's unclear to me whether that is showing me a pre-development scenario or whether that is a post-development, i.e. a development platform has been installed and the ground levels have been changed. So it's unclear whether that is pre or post-development. And then the third and probably the most important of my points, and that is that with all flood models, so with the Environment Agency, with models that I would build or review, there is a level of uncertainty and unknown, which means they have to be dealt with caution. I'd like to draw the inspector's attention to section 4 of my supplemental report. Are you there, sir? Yes, sir. Yeah, good. What I've done within this is I've recorded an event on the 26th of November last year where there was heavy rainfall in the locality of the site. And the authority undertook an officer inspection the following morning on the 27th of November. And the photographic records from that inspection are included within Appendix B, sorry, of that report. And I think probably before we look at those photos, it may be worth understanding the probability and the likelihood of that rainfall event. So fortuitously, there's a DEVRA rainfall measurement station located at Elmsbridge. This site is approximately 1,500 metres from the appeal sites in a northeast direction, and is located where the watercourse Cobblers Brook flows northwards towards the River Wey. There's a DEVRA rainfall gauging station there. That information is publicly available. So that the gauging station is located on the position between the Elmbridge Road, crosses over the Cobblers Brook watercourse.
Would it be helpful if we could have it pointed out on one of the paths that shows the photograph points?
Oh, is there a plan showing the wider area I could use?
Mr. Smythe is the one that shows the site visit route, which has Hascombe Hill to the north and an area down as far south as Dunsfold Aerodrome. I don't know if that's...
What's the...
I wonder if there's a
reference for
spare
that?
one that Mr. Smythe could have.
Or just a document?
I don't know whether it was added to the website documents yesterday or the day before.
Don't know.
Yes, it'd be online. We just need a
Larger scale map so he can just point to it, I think. I mean, you've got your historic maps within part 10 of your evidence. You've got the one published in 1912, and then you've got the Ordnance Survey. I mean, the Ordnance Survey one at tile 2 on Appendix 10, that looks to be a bit too close in. I'm not sure that's going to be far out enough. Yeah, was that? Is this the walking route?
No, tile 2, it's just out of reach of that plan.
So what's the number of this one?
An inquiry document.
Inspector, have you got your route map? Yeah, you've got that in front of you. So I've got that with the landscape stuff, and I've not got a copy immediately to hand, but I've got a similar version that shows the wider area here that I think will be broadly contemporaneous with that. So if I pass that to the witness, and then that should enable him to point it out.
Thank you. Would you like me to mark it?
Yep. And then shall we all come round, Inspector, and then we can all look at it together.
So as we've located the rainfall station, it's worth noting this is on a national hydrological database and it's freely available to the public to view and look at. So I've downloaded the rainfall information from that day and I've included that for record in Appendix C of my information. And then I've noted there, highlighted in yellow in Appendix C, an area of a period of time totaling 8.5 hours of consistent rainfall. It's very small, but if one was to effectively blow it up, it would see that that yellow highlighted area represents an 8.5 hour rainfall event. And then the measurements taken from the DEFRA measurement station indicate a rainfall totaling 28.08 millimetres of rain fell in that 8.5 hour period.
And can I just ask, in respect of that 8.5 hour period that we can see there from 11 p.m. until 7:30 a.m., are you able to discern from that when the worst effects are likely to have been felt from that rainfall or not?
It's hard to say without undertaking a sort of a detailed catchment analysis. But noting the catchment size is relatively small for the Wards course on the north of the Lydia Park access track. And also note that the Lydia Park area is quite heavily paved. Rainfall falling on that area would rapidly flow towards the low ground. So the peak for that rainfall event would probably be happening in the early hours or the early morning of the 27th. And it's the precise grid references I don't know, but I believe it's on the north side of the road. Yes, yep. And if you were, as the crow flies, as it were, to take a straight line from the appeal sites towards that measurement station, that is approximately 1,500 metres.
That is where certain faults from the hillside would.
Eventually, yes, it would flow from the area, from the development site through the unnamed water course. It then joins Cobbler's Brook, which is an Environment Agency water course, and it then flows northwards towards Guildford, and where it joins the River Wey.
Okay, and so you've taken us to that information, and at your Appendix D, you give us the basis for your rainfall period calculation, which you say is 1 in 1.67 years.
Yeah.
So what does that mean in terms of, we've talked about 1 in 30 years. What does 1 in 1.67 years mean then in terms of the frequency?
I've used that Appendix D to calculate a return period for that flood event. So the return period is the likelihood of that rainfall event occurring. So when we talk about the 1 in 100 year event, we're referring to a rainfall of such intensity and duration that would only happen once every 100 years. And it's probably worth noting that the design event that we need to design for in the industry is the 1 in 100 year event with an appropriate allowance for climate change, which is normally 40%. for surface water. So in Appendix D of that document, I calculate using recognised flood estimation tools that rainfall 1 in 1.67 year event.
So where we got into this, Inspector, was we were going through a comparison of the Flood Map 4 and the Environment Agency latest flood maps. And the witness was giving you his 3 points as to why the Environment Agency mapping is more reliable. Can you just conclude on that point then, in terms of
So
where
I'd
we've
like
got to?
just draw the inspector's attention to Appendix B. B. These are the photographs from Mr. Bennett on the late morning of the 27th of November. So as we can see there, these photographs record the access track, and it can be seen on, I think, page 3, the area around the development sites north of Lydia Park is shown flooded.
What
Page 3 of the reports. So page 4 is a good one as well. So page 4 shows the land looking towards appeal sites B and C. Yep, and that can be seen flooded. Yeah, so the view of the camera is viewing east, slightly northeast. So it's as if you were standing a few meters east of appeal sites C and D access point, and you were looking in an easterly direction towards Stovolds Hill. Yeah. Yep. And then 4 is standing at effectively the junction between C and D and the Lydia Park access track. And it's worth noting that the floodwater is over the top of the curb. It's infilling the land around the access track. I also note page 6. It shows, I think, appeal site. Well, it does show appeal site B. And also, if the inspector was to look at page 8, so that shows appeal site A in the background of that photo, and it shows floodwater flowing along the access track. It shows there's a XC90 parked up there with a trailer, but the point to note is there's floodwater flowing along the access track and looks to be flowing over the curb there, indicating a flood depth of up to 150 millimetres. So I'd like to draw the inspector's attention back to the point I was making regarding figure 8. So figure 8 in the description is described as showing no flooding for the most extreme event, even in the extreme return period of 1 in 1,000 year storm event. within the photos, Inspector, the area labelled there as access as existing is shown to be inundated with floodwater for the 1 in 1.67 year event. So the level of confidence that could be associated with this plan, which seems to show to us that there is no flooding for the 1 in 1,000 year event, is contradicted by the evidence of the photos in my supplementary reports. So I think when one considers the old flood map information, the flood map 4 information, and the new surface water flood maps produced by the Environment Agency, of the 3 data sets presented in front of me to show flooding, the most accurate, appropriate that we should use is Appendix A of my supplemental information, which is the new Environment Agency flood maps. And I proceed in the basis of my evidence to base my findings on those maps. And I would urge you to do the same.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate you've only just been past this and it's not numbered, but I want to ask you about the EA guidance notes that you've been provided by my learned friend. And I'm counting in, if you take that in hand, from the contents page, calling that page 1, and then counting in 2, 3, 4, and then the 5th page in, we've got a page starts uses and limitations. So if you can
Sorry,
just,
can I
when
just
you,
get
if you
that?
find it, sorry, I didn't
Ah,
realize.
there we go.
Yeah,
Yep.
you've got it. So
Sorry, you were saying page 5?
yeah, count into page 5 just from the beginning, and you should get to a page there which has uses and limitations at the top of it. Go another one.
That one?
No, next one, I think, or maybe the one
No,
back.
that was that.
So you should have some underline. Can you see some underlined
Yes,
text?
yes, I
Okay.
do. So it
So that's
starts-
actually page 6, I think. So the beginning of the previous page to the underlining, Leonard's friends put a asterisk underneath the wording suitability and limitations. So if you turn back from the page you're on to the previous one, and at the bottom of that page on the left-hand side, you should see an asterisk.
Yes,
Yep,
so
all right.
I think the Environment Agency are making the point here that, as with all modelling and flood estimation, it's not an exact science, and it needs to be fully understood to effectively be taken in context. What we've got with this site is real fact evidence information showing the impact of a 1 in 1.67 year event, showing severe flooding around the appeal sites. What it goes on to say is that the confidence category assigned, which provides an indicative confidence level for each cell. And at the start of the second paragraph, the EA say that the risk of floodwater map outputs are generally not suitable for property level assessment. Instead, they estimate the flood risk to an area of land.
And so pause there for a moment, and I want you to think over all that you've just told the inspector about the EA mapping and it being more useful on rural areas where you've got steep areas, what you've said about the insurance companies using the information for the flood map 4 in urban areas, and the area of land that you've described to the inspector, the catchment of it, how it drains. Can you, no, I'm asking him to think about all of that information, then I'm going to put an open question in respect of which. So having all of that information that you've just gone through, which I've just repeated and not put a question in respect of, can you then help the inspector with this open question, looking at those words, ROFSW outputs are generally not suitable for property level assessment. Instead, they estimate flood risk to an area of land. In respect of this these particular appeals and this area of land, what's your professional view as to what the appropriate mapping that the inspector should be putting most reliance on is?
The appropriate mapping to use in assessing this site is shown in Appendix A of my supplemental information.
Thank you. All right, so we come then, Inspector, on to the sequential test and the engagement and search area, and then the site size in comparison with other sites. And I want to deal with that point first then. So in terms of the sequential test, we've got the way Mr. Woods has addressed it in his evidence and the way you put it in your rebuttal. Can you help the inspector then with this issue of what the appropriate search area would be, as you say, and how that compares with what Mr. Woods has done? And can you help us with what you say about the means of dealing with that and ascribing it?
Yep. So Mr. Woods has undertaken a sequential test, and it's worth noting the test has been undertaken in isolation without the engagement of the local authority. And I note within the guidance on the sequential test, there's a need to consult with the local authority to agree the parameters of a sequential test. These key parameters include the search area and the size of plot. This hasn't been undertaken as part of Mr. Woods' sequential test.
And I think you take us to a decision in your evidence that we can find, can't we, within your rebuttal evidence, which is in CDA 10.4. And we can see that in Appendix B to that evidence. It's called the land west of Highland Brow, Galgate, Lancaster. So if you could just quickly turn that up.
Yeah, and it's paragraph 28, Inspector, that I'd like to take you to.
Well,
28 and 31.
So 28 underneath whether the sequential test is satisfied, what do you draw from that paragraph in terms of search area?
I think on the third line down, it says, firstly, the area of search should be agreed. This would be defined by local circumstances relating to the catchment for the type of development proposed. The local authority will need to determine an appropriate search area based on the development type proposed and the relative spatial policies.
Now, Mr. Woods has determined the borough as a suitable search area, and you explain that you differ. Can you just remind us why you differ in relation to this particular site?
What I note with the location of this site with regard to the rest of the borough is it's on the edge of the borough, and what I feel is appropriate for this sequential test application would be to take a 15-mile radius of the appeal sites. And I think I suggest in my rebuttal paragraph 2.11, this represents a half-hour drive, which I would consider to be a suitable parameter to apply in terms of a search area. And that would be a radial searched area of 15 miles centred on the appeal sites.
Okay, so the next issue, Inspector, then that I identified was site size. So we've got information from Mr. Woods in respect of what size of site he's carried out the sequential test for. And can you just remind us where the two of you differ on this issue then, and why you say what you do say in your rebuttal evidence.
Yeah, so within the rebuttal. So regarding effectively the criteria for development size, Mr. Wood outlines a space requirement of 500 metres squared per unit. I think it's, oh, I'll get that back up.
So he's at 2.19 of his rebuttal proof, he's referring to Mr. Wood's proof at page 53 under section 9.47.
So, yeah, page 53 under section 4.7. So 0.47. Right, so I note a third of a hectare has been taken as a search criteria. And that's taken to reflect a plot size for an individual caravan of 500 metres squared. I note that appeal site B has three plots on it. And I note that 3 times 500 metres squared is 0.15 of a hectare. And I note appeal site A is for a single plot. And that would be for 0.05 of a hectare. And if we were considering a scenario where both development A and B are co-located as one, we would be talking of 0.2 or fifth of a hectare, which is roughly half an acre.
Now you've put in some guidance for us again on this particular topic in the form of the Lancaster decision in Appendix B. And when we had that open in front of us before, you referred to 2 paragraphs, 28 and 31. Is it the second of those paragraphs you would like us to look at in terms of this site size area?
So in the second half of that, noting there's some comment regarding using a plus or minus 10%, which I have seen used in other sequential tests, but the comment here of note is that with details of reasonably available sites, they could include a series of smaller sites or part of a larger site, which would be capable of accommodating the proposed development.
Okay.
So what that's suggesting and saying is that a series of smaller sites could be taken to fulfill the criteria of a larger site.
So let's then have a look at the comparison that Mr. Woods has carried out in his evidence. The first point I'd like you to deal with in terms of this actual comparison is what we're told in respect of allocated sites within the NPPF. So with allocated sites, what are we told about that in respect of flood risk?
Well, I'd like to kind of go to the NPPF, which just sets the framework. So within paragraph 180, it clearly says that where planning applications have come forward through the local plan.
Hold on a moment till you've got.
Yep, so where planning applications come forward on sites allocated in the development plan through the sequential test, applicants need not apply the sequential test again.
So what does that mean in respect of DS 15 to 20 and in terms of whether or not they're, in terms of flooding, sequentially preferable?
So they're deemed to have passed the sequential test.
Mr. Smythe, on that reference that you've just taken us to in para 180 of the NPPF.
180, yeah?
Yeah. Isn't there a caveat at the end of the paragraph.
Yes, it says that the exception test may need to be reapplied if various aspects of the proposal had not been considered when the test
sequential.
was applied at plan making stage, or more recent information about risk, existing or potential risk should be taken into account. So although you don't apply the sequential test, you may look at the allocated sites in light of the exception test, particularly with respect to safety and flood risk,
Yeah.
if conditions in and around those allocated sites have changed significantly with regard to flood risk.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so you make that general point in respect of the allocated sites, but you also make a specific point in respect of site DS15, where Mr. Woods deals with that, and he provides a table, a page 50 table in respect of DS15. So I just ask you to remind us of where you differ from Mr. Woods in relation to that element and DS15.
So there's a table produced on page 50 of Mr.
Yeah.
Woods.
So DS15.
Yeah.
So yeah, DS15. So I differ on this point.
So just wait while we turn up Mr. Wood's appendices and his page 50, so we can see the point you're making whilst looking at that.
Yeah, so DS15.
So as I say, leaving aside the position as per the MPPF and what 180 says in terms of that, looking at the specifics of what's said on DS15, what's the difference between you in respect of that as to whether this is sequentially preferable or not?
So with DS15, and this is shown on page 50, there is a small band of low risk flooding across that site. And when one was to compare it with the appeal sites, which at the time showed a relatively thick band of low and medium risk across the site, my view is that DS15 is sequentially preferable to the proposed development sites.
Okay, and then the next element that Mr. Woods addresses in terms of his sequential test is the comparison with land for sale, and we can see that later down on that same page that he's got 9.49 on, where he looks at a series of sites. And you deal with this within your rebuttal evidence as well. Can you just help us and remind us with where the two of you differ in respect of how this has been gone through and what it shows?
Yep, so I just get to the point. So I think Mr. Woods talks about available sites on page 53.
Yep.
Yes, and I'll talk about it within my rebuttal, but Mr. Woods identifies 7 sites that could be secured, and they're numbered 1 to 7. I found there was a lack of information with respect to flood risk on these 7 sites. And I noted for site 3, which I managed to identify in terms of location, I undertook my own flood analysis, which is presented in Appendix D of my rebuttal. Within that information, no flooding was shown on site number 3.
And is
And it-
that, you've referred us to Appendix D, you've numbered the appendices within your rebuttal proof. So my note says that's page 22 of the Appendix D, Inspector. So do you want us to have a look at that?
Yes. To this site, shown with an approximate red line.
My flooding rebuttal evidence of Mr. Smythe goes to Appendix C, is it?
It may be that some of the A4 stuff may be in the document. If you click on the main rebuttal.
Well, this is from the website.
I believe some of the higher resolution plans were split into separate appendices.
So if you look on page 2, Stephen, of the rebuttal, you'll see that you've got appendices listed from A, B, C, D, E, and F. And the first 3 are appeals, and we've gone to those in part already. And then Appendix D is consideration of Culver Lane site. And it's that appendix that you can find with internal page number 22 or 21 and following, really. Just turning that up, Inspector.
Did you find it okay? If you click on the main document. Yep, and then you scroll to the bottom of any window that opens.
Yeah, so if
You
you
see the latter appendices are included within there.
22. Well, 22 is what he's asked to look at. It's a good job we turned that up then, actually.
Yep. Yep, so that red edge site represents that Coleman Lane, with just less than half an acre. And it shows no flooding associated with that. Which also shows this site would be sequentially preferable in terms of flooding compared to the appeal sites. It's worth noting, I couldn't find mapping information for these 7 sites. So I would therefore conclude that also sites 1 and 3 would also be taken as sequentially preferable in terms of flood risk.
Well, this one's 3, so just have a look at Mr. Woods's 9.49 and just confirm which ones you're referring to
So-
other than 3 then.
1, 2, and 3. Yep.
And the point you made in terms of the search area then, is that a point which, and the size that it should be, is that a point that relates to the search that Mr. Woods has done in 9.49 then, and how he's come up with these 7 sites?
Well, it looks to me like site number 2 has been discounted for being out of search area.
And that's what I'm asking you. So in terms of what you said about the way that you look for the size of site and the way that you look across the area for sites, are those considerations relevant to the exercise in 9.49?
Yes, and it shows that some sites have been discounted based on being out of area. against an unagreed area search criteria.
Okay,
Which,
so,
like I said, I believe was more appropriate as a 15-mile radius.
so can I just, Inspector, I'm thinking that we're just coming to the end of the sequential test element. So can I just ask the witness to summarise where we are in respect of that, and then perhaps if we have our mid-morning break, and we'll move on to the next topic after that.
Yeah, so regarding the sequential test, an assessment must be undertaken to drive development into the areas that are at least risk from flooding from any form. So an assessment has been presented here that I see as inadequate in terms of search area, concerns regarding site size, and the engineering assessment associated with flood risk on each site has not been undertaken appropriately. I therefore do not agree with the conclusions of Mr. Wood, and I cannot see how the appeal sites can be demonstrated sequentially preferable to the other sites considered.
Thank you, Inspector.
Just to cover one or two queries, Mr. Smythe. I think there's reference earlier on in the documentation to the appeal sites being in flood zone 1, where the sequential test wouldn't be necessary. But I think
Yes, I don't think I was going to go into that.
Is that a reference to a different
I
kind
was
of
just
flooding?
about to go into that, actually. Yeah, so the flood zones, and a note in the 28 of the under FRA, the flood zones are associated with river and coastal flooding.
Yes.
The requirement here is to consider any form of flooding. And the conclusions drawn in that under FRA are flawed because it does not consider the surface water flood risk associated with these development proposals.
And perhaps to remind the Inspector of when you looked at the flood zones at the outset and you compared them to the probability of flooding in the 1 in 30, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, you helped the Inspector with where that fell on that scale.
So
yes, I've
the
got
flood zone
my note
1
of that.
Yeah.
is the very low.
Yes.
So a greater event than the 1 in 1,000.
I think you said there are areas of high and medium risk. Is that right?
Yep. So for high risk, it would be zone B in terms of river flooding.
3B.
Medium would be 3A. Zone 2 would be 1 in 1,000. And zone 1 would be at a risk lower than 1 in 1,000. So in undertaking a flood risk regarding zone 1 and river flooding, the site is in flood zone 1 in
Yes.
terms of rivers, but it is in a high probability, a 1 in 30 chance for surface water.
Surface water. So surface water is your concern?
Yes, absolutely.
And if it helps, Inspector, that the next element of the examination in chief involves looking at the exception test and whether that should be applied.
Yes.
And that obviously involves looking at table 2, which is the flood risk vulnerability
Yes.
and the zoning compatibility, and the witness will address. That's why
Okay.
I'll
Just one
respond to
final
that.
question from me for now, then,
Yeah.
Mr. Smythe. That's whether there should be an allowance for climate change.
Yes, well, in my proof, I note that there isn't allowance for climate change.
And should there be even with surface water?
There should be when considering the design flood. But it's worth saying, in undertaking a sequential test exercise, as long as the person undertaking the sequential test considers all sites equally, so either all sites with climate change or all sites unadjusted for climate change, then the sequential test can be considered appropriate.
Right, but what about the latest EA mapping?
So the surface water flooding shown in Appendix A doesn't show the climate change allowance.
That's what I wanted to be clear
No, it
about.
doesn't.
Yeah.
And so I suppose just to continue the inspector's point, if one was to model the flooding on the site, would there be a requirement or not to take climate change into account in addition, if you were to do that exercise?
Yes, absolutely. So within the PPG, the MPPF, it talks about now and in the future. PPG specifically requires climate change allowances to be included when one is considering the design of it.
Okay. We'll leave it there. Take the break as suggested, and then resume with the next topic. 10 minutes, please. And inquiry is adjourned. Resume at 12:05.
Thank you, Inspector.
Because that's not showing anything here.
It is working. The camera's just not always panning to this,
Yeah,
to this, yeah, the witness.
so it's,
So we can hear everything.
Yes.
so then you just do that, right? Okay. Blah, blah, blah.
Test.
Test, test.
Test over here
So
in the
it's just
centre.
showing you now.
Yeah.
Oh, there's me. That's odd. It doesn't show me here, please.
That's got delay.
Oh, has it got a delay? Oh, there we go. Okay. If I switch that on, it comes to me. Yeah, that's probably better, huh? That one. Because this is on still.
Just make a noise into that one.
Test, test.
Testing, testing, testing. You go.
So it doesn't come to here. Testing, testing, testing. No, and it's on. So not that one. Okay, so you've switched that off and now it's come to me. Testing, testing, testing. Interesting. One is better. I don't think we can do it.
Time to resume. There were just two things that I'd intended to mention to Mr. Smythe before we adjourn, which I didn't. Just quickly pick those up now. One's a very small point. It's in your original proof, Mr. Smythe.
Okay.
And paragraph 5.97 on page 47. It's only a very short paragraph. I just wondered whether there's some missing text because of the way it reads, and that we haven't got a complete version.
Sorry, paragraph number?
5.97.
Oh, sorry, what?
Page 47.
Page
Oh,
47.
sorry, I was on
It's the
57.
paragraph just under the bold appendix 4, and you can see that it ends, the inspector saying, however, the report, then there's a full stop afterwards.
It reads as though there may be a
I
qualification.
think I probably would have said, however, the information provided is lacking. I think I'm referring to the Flume report in that section, I think kind of 5.73 onwards.
Right.
So should the inspector just put, because you go on to explain things further down, but it stops, doesn't it? So are you saying he should put, however, the Flume in practice
Yeah,
report, and then
I
it's
think it would
lacking
have
or
been,
something?
however, the report doesn't show this information or words to that effect.
Okay. And the other question was just about the updated mapping. I just wanted to be clear about dates in my own mind, because I think you'd said that it was based on, there was basic LiDAR data from 2019.
That's correct, yep.
The mapping itself, we've got a date of, for your figure 1 of 2025 on page 6. But on the previous page, it says it was released in January
Yeah,
2025. And then the other part of the dates is there a particular date that it's predicted to relate to? In other words, was it undertaken to relate to a period of so many years, or?
No, it just presents the latest information.
Right, and the latest information, what's the, we've got the release date and then a publication date. I'm not quite sure why those are different, but what date does it relate to? What date's the modelling undertaken for?
It's to represent the current risk.
So what
As
when
in the
it
present
was
day
released?
risk. It was released at the end of January of this
So
year.
is that the date it relates to?
And that was a national, so a nationwide update of all the Environment Agency flood mapping with respect
Yes.
to surface water. There was a national update of information at the end of January of this year.
Right, so is the expectation of the EA that it relates to the position as at January this year, when they released it?
It relates to kind of the current risk associated with an area shown on the mapping. But the base data used to inform the mapping in terms of topography is the 2019 LiDAR.
So just so you understand our position, we say that the base date is 2019, and that's the date.
Well, you'll have an opportunity, Mr. Masters.
I know, but you were asking this witness. I just want you to know what our case was.
So the base data in relation to
Topography.
topography.
So
Yeah.
the lay of the land.
Yes. But that's the 2019 reference. Is it just to topography?
Yes.
And then when you say, I just want to try and understand what you mean by current.
Yeah, so the EA is saying that if they've got additional information regarding historic or recent flood events,
Yes.
they would work that into the mapping.
Yes.
If they've got information from the lead local flood authority associated with any other modelling that they deem
So that's put
suitable,
into the model as well.
they would add that into the model as well. So it's the latest current picture of what they expect, but it is noted that the topography used for that is 6 years old.
Yes, and then other information, if there is any, is added in.
Would
And-
be up to, would be up to the date that it was released, which was January of
Right.
2025.
So the latest any information could be would be January.
If there's any
2000.
enhanced information that the
Yes.
Environment Agency used, it would be up to the date that it was released.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Lintop, thanks.
So, Inspector, there are 2 points of housekeeping that have arisen. The first is that I've been asked by Hanscombe Parish Council whether or not, having had a look at your timetable, they might be permitted to make a short closing submission in addition to the main parties on, I think it's Friday, in accordance with the latest timetable. So I've told them I would pass that request on to you and ask you to consider that. The second point of housekeeping, which is perhaps more urgent given where we are in the proceedings,
Yes.
is that at 9:56 this morning, Peter Brown John forwarded to Victoria Chilarton and John Bennett a condition which says, further to discussions held toward the end of yesterday and the reference to additional conditions proposed, please see below. My witness obviously is in examination, so I can't talk to him. I haven't passed this on to him. I've not been able to discuss it with him, even had I wanted to. I obviously make the comment that it's unsatisfactory to be provided at this stage in the proceedings, etc. But I just mentioned that for this, so you know that has been received, and how we deal with it. Obviously, we'll need to think about that and look at it in terms of where we are in the proceedings. I haven't read the condition yet. I've just literally.
He
got
just
it.
knows that
Yeah.
it exists.
So have you got a copy of this?
Have I got? No,
No,
nothing's
perhaps
been
you
sent
should-
to me.
Perhaps you should have a copy, and then you'll see what we're talking about.
Well, we're not talking about it now.
Yeah.
Well, you just raised it, so we are.
No, I've
aren't we?
said
No,
I've been given it.
we were not, Mr. Masters. Mr. Lintott simply made me aware it exists. I'll take a copy.
Yeah, but some.
But I'm not going to discuss it now.
No, well, not. But sorry, sir.
Thanks.
I want to say this about it, and I'm entitled to, since Mr. Lindolf has raised it. We're not going to get on to cross-examination till after lunch. I have no objection to Mr. Lindolf and Mr. Smythe discussing it because it's clearly relevant, and Mr. Lindolf discussed it, the conditions yesterday in some detail with, so he'll be fully aware of it. I
Well,
will
he
then
won't know till he sees what it is, will he?
yeah, and then I will be intending to ask him questions about the condition when I cross-examine him. So it would be beneficial for him to read it and for them to discuss it in relation to those matters over lunchtime.
Well, I'll have a look at it, but I've already said what my position is in terms of new areas. I'm not stopping it being raised, but it may not be suitable for it to be raised now, just with very little time for the other party to consider it.
It's not a new area to Mr. Smythe. It's
Well,
been-
I don't know, and I don't want to discuss that now because we're simply
Okay.
delaying getting on with matters. In terms of the Hanscombe point, Mr. Linton, the council's going to get back to them. It's, as far as closings are concerned, it would really only be appropriate for a main party, and we don't
Yeah.
have any rule 6 parties.
No, I appreciate that, but they obviously
So
asked me to
I'm
raise
afraid
that
the
with
answer
you.
is no. They've been able to participate, and we've still got Councillor Watson to come.
Yep.
But yeah,
That's helpful. Thank you, Inspector. All right, so moving on to the second issue then, which is the exception test. And the first sub-issue within that was, well, whether one applies the exception test. Could you just have a quick look to remind us of what the NPPF says before we go on to look at this in more detail? And I have in mind on the page we've just been looking at, the NPPF deals with this on page 51.
Yep, and it's paragraph 177.
So just pause while we all get that in front of us. And we can see there 177, having applied the sequential test, if it is not possible for development to be located in areas with a lower risk of flooding, taking into account wider sustainable development objectives, the exception test may have to be applied. So what does that tell us in terms of the stage in proceedings at which one might be applying the exception test?
So one would only apply the exception test when the sequential test is deemed to have been passed. And I note 17 says the exception test may have to be applied. And then the framework guides us towards the flood risk vulnerability classifications as set out in Appendix 3, where we talked about caravans and noted that these were highly vulnerable. And 1777 says the need for the exception test will depend on the potential vulnerability of the site and of the development proposed. And Inspector, I'd like to take you to page 26 and 27 of my proof of evidence, please. Yep, so page 26.
And so while you're doing that, Inspector, we've got what Mr. Woods says within his evidence at page 56. He obviously deals with the exception test after the sequential test. And at his 9.55, he says that on the assumption that the sequential test is passed, because of course that's his case, the development that is proposed is also considered to be a form of highly vulnerable development. And as such, the exception test will be required as evidenced by my figure 2 above. And he's provided the flood risk vulnerability classification table at under 9.54. And you'll see at 26 of Mr. Smythe's evidence, he's also produced that flood risk vulnerability table. So that's the issue that we're looking at in a world in which we've decided that the sequential test is passed. And so we can look at the exception test. What do we do?
Yeah. So if we look at across the top of table 2, which comes from the PPG paragraph 73. So you'll see that it's split into 5 columns across the top, titled essential infrastructure, highly vulnerable, more vulnerable, less vulnerable, and water compatibility. And it's worth noting, so essential infrastructure would be things like substations, and as used in, I think, ID 11, which I talked about earlier. Highly vulnerable, that's the category for caravans and park homes. More vulnerable would be the category for domestic brick-built houses. Less vulnerable would be commercial, so agricultural buildings or warehouses. And then water compatible would be things like mineral extraction, like a sand quarry or a fishery. As I said, so we're dealing with highly vulnerable. So that's the second column along. And what this vulnerability and compatibility table tells us is there are 4 rows there. The top row is the lowest risk, which is zone 1. And then as we proceed down the rows, the level of risk with respect to flooding increases. So it goes from zone 1, zone 2, zone 3A, and zone 3B. And if we just turn the page onto page 27, paragraph 78 defines these in terms of probability. So very low is 0.1%. So that's where the 1 in 1,000 I mentioned earlier comes from. Medium is land with risk associated between the 1% and the 0.1%. So this is between the 1 in 100 and the 1 in 1,000. If you turn the page to page 28, zone 3A, and that's described as having a probability less than 1%, less than 1 in 100. And the zone 3B, described as the functional floodplain to the area that frequently floods, that's defined as having a probability of 3.3%, which is the 1 in 30 frequency. And that's the basis and the read across in terms of risk levels between the flood zones for river flooding and for surface water flooding. So if we now look back at table 2 on page 26, the lowest row, the zone 3B, represents the 1 in 30 probability of flooding. That's the high risk surface water. The row above that, the zone 3A, represents the 1 in 100. And that's the medium risk of surface water flooding. The zone 2, which is the third row from the bottom, represents the 1 in 1,000 risk level, which is the low surface water risk. And then the top row, labelled zone 1, is the very low, so risk levels lower than 1 in 1,000. And in surface water terms, that's described as very low.
So what does that table tell us, firstly, about the appropriateness of highly vulnerable development within flood zone 3B as to whether or not passing the exception test can make it acceptable or not?
Well, as you can see there, in the column for highly vulnerable, an exception test is not needed where risks are very low, or one would have a site within zone 1 for river flooding or coastal. The exception test is allowable in flood zone 2. So this is the 1 in 1,000 year risk. So where there is low risk of surface water flooding, it's allowable that one would apply the exception test. And then the lower 2 rows, representing the 1 in 100 and the 1 in 30, so the medium and the high risk areas, there's a cross within table 2. And it says that development should not be permitted where risk levels are 1 in 100 or 1 in 30. So that to me indicates that the exception test cannot be applied where risk levels of flooding are at the highest level.
So that's issue 1, but even so, let's have a look at what the exception test would require on the assumption that it could make development acceptable in respect of the 2 elements that are described within paragraph 178 of the NPPF. And we can see in 178 that the exception test is focused on 2 factors, A and B. The first of them is sustainability benefits, which are not a matter for technical flood evidence, but B is that the development will be safe for its lifetime, taking account of the vulnerability of its users without increasing flood risk elsewhere, and will, where possible, reduce flood risk overall. So in respect of those two categories, what I want you to do is to move on to my next two issues as outlined to the inspector at the beginning of your examination in chief. The first one being flood risk elsewhere, the second one being safety. And in dealing with the first one of those, without increasing flood risk elsewhere, can you help the inspector first, please, with the pre-development position and the water course, and then come on to look at the post-development position and what has changed and what the effects of that are?
Yep, certainly. So starting with the pre-development situation. So the sites before development would have consisted of open, unpaved agricultural land, I note partly wooded in places. And in drainage terms, I'd refer to that as a greenfield scenario, in that the land is undeveloped and it's rural in nature. And if I could draw the inspector's attention to, I think it's Appendix 10 of my proof. It's historic maps and aerial photography.
So you'll find it, Inspector, about, it's the very last couple of pages. So it's 5 or 6 pages from the end of those appendices. Yeah. So just count 6 pages from the back, basically.
Yep. Yep. So the first tile is effectively a historic map from over 100 years ago. And I just want to note that there's a watercourse clearly shown with arrows on it flowing from Thatched House Farm from the west towards the east. And if the inspector is to turn over to the next page where I've labelled it tile 2, and then we zoom in a bit on the development areas. And you'll see just above where it says Thatched House Farm, there is a blue line from the pond at Thatched House Farm. This blue line represents the ordinary watercourse. And I think just for note, I think I've also included tile 3. Where one can see an undeveloped landscape, so green fields, unpaved and rural in nature. I view this condition of the site as the pre-development baseline. And it's worth noting that the topography used within the Environment Agency historic mapping is from 2019, which shows a pre-development scenario. I'd just like to make that point for use later.
And then what do we see if we turn over to just complete the tiles? Then you've got a tile 5, 4 and a tile 5.
Yeah, so I think it's a timeline of satellite imagery, so we can see tile 4 and 5, the more developments happening in the area. Tile 6, again, further development. Tile 7 represents the latest satellite image, which shows the paving associated with, so the hard standing can be seen for appeals B, C and D, but it's also noted that the land south of the Lydia Park access track is also paved, and I think there, although there's a shadow over the aerial photography there, it can be seen that there are lots of caravans and paved surface in the area opposite appeal sites B, C and D.
And you were saying, before I interrupted you, that that accords with the information shown on the mapping produced by the Environment Agency.
That's correct, yes.
And where did you want to go from there then? Do we need to go and have a look at the situation post-development and
Yeah,
how you describe that, or do you think you've done that?
I have. I think I'd just also like to take the inspector to Appendix 9. Yep, so it's a plan which shows the 4 appeal sites, and it's got the contour mapping, so indicating where the lower ground is. I think what's notable to see here is that the lower land is shown north of the Lydia Park access track, and that is consistent with the EA flood maps, which show flooding in the land north of Lydia Park access track, and it also shows flooding over Stovolds Hill in the area just north of the junction of the access track and Stovolds Hill. So I would note that the mapping as shown in that appendix coincides with the flood mapping as produced in my Appendix A. Now I'd like to consider the post-development watercourse scenario. So as part of the development works for the 4 appeal sites, hard surface paving and earthworks to form respective development platforms for the siting of caravans and mobile homes have been undertaken. I think in section 3 of my proof, I describe the situation with each of the development sites. And I would note that the greenfield natural soil has been removed from these site locations, and the area has been covered with a macadam or compacted granular material, such as hardcore or scalpings. And areas of hard standing have been formed. This development surface is different to the pre-development surface, which was a vegetated topsoil shown green in the aerial photos. And it's noted that the topsoil would previously have been exposed to rainfall. Post-development.
Mr. Smythe, can I just check one thing with you in terms of what you've actually considered in terms of the post-development situation? Have you looked at what's on site or what's proposed to be on site, which is what's before me?
I've visited the site,
yes,
and seen what's proposed or built.
Because I'm not sure that it's exactly the same in every case. I don't know without going on site. For example, the site plan for the smaller site, Site A, which is there, does show hard standing near the access track, but not going the full depth of the site. And I'm not sure if that's consistent with what you might have seen.
I haven't been inside appeal site A, so I couldn't comment.
Right.
The notes within section 3 of my proof note that the areas associated with the appeal sites are paved with hard standing. And I think that's supported by the aerial imagery presented in Appendix 10. So the point to note here is the ordinary watercourse, shown as that long blue line on the Ordnance Survey map, has been infilled as part of the development works. And as I say in my proof, I did visit the site in July of last year. And I did note that a pipe has been installed. And this is consistent with the approximate alignment of the watercourse that is now being infilled and removed. And I note within the information submitted as part of the application, there are two separate flood risks associated with the site. So for Appeal Site A, Flume have produced a flood risk assessment. And I just note within that report, the watercourse isn't identified, considered. What I do note within page 14 is a statement is made regarding riparian drainage and riparian drainage rights and the requirement to keep. And that means to maintain the conveyance of water across your land. It's referring to the need to undertake maintenance and look after any pipes. And I think figure 2 of the Flume report labels a culverted ditch. And then I also note in the under report, which covers the other 3 appeal sites, so this is sites B, C and D. I think on page 29, I think it's the 5th paragraph. The FRA describes an open watercourse that flows across the development sites. And I would suggest that information is predicated on the watercourse being open and free flowing. That is not the case for this development. As I said previously, the ditch has been infilled, removed, and a pipe has been installed in place of it.
So can you help us then with, given what you've said, the adequacy or not of the survey information that you have seen in relation to this issue?
Well, firstly, regarding general survey of the site and levels, I can see from the site visit that levels have been raised and there has been earthwork operations, but I can't see within the plans and the information the details of that. And when considering the pipe, so I did go to site and I looked in a manhole chamber. I couldn't tell precisely the size of the pipe. It's either a 225 or a 300, but for an assessment purposes, 225 millimeters diameter, or a 300. So it's either a 9-inch or a 12-inch pipe. To ensure conservative assessment, I've assumed it was a 300. So a 300 millimeter diameter pipe. I've then assessed this in a hand calc that I've produced within Appendix 11 of my proof of evidence. So within that Appendix 11, and Yeah, so,
Yeah, that's right, Inspector.
so after the historic mapping, there's an open flow channel calculation in which I determine the flow capacity of a ditch, noting the ditch wasn't there. So I've had to estimate the size, shape of the ditch based on the existing ditch downstream that I noted. So in undertaking this calculation, I determined that the flow capacity of that ditch is 782 litres per second. 82. So this is the ability of the ditch to convey water along its length. I then looked at the flow capacity of a 300mm diameter pipe. The flow capacity of a 12-inch pipe is 69 litres per second. 300 diameter, that's the size of the pipe. 69. So I then compared the ditch capacity, which is 782, with the capacity that a pipe can handle, which is 69. And in that, I note that there's a 91% reduction in capacity when one compares the pipe's ability to convey water compared to the ditch's ability to convey water. So I note that this is a substantial reduction in capacity.
So can you then come on to consider then, as part of this first issue, given that by way of background, what this means for the inspector with what he would need to look at if he were looking at the exception test, and whether or not those criteria in 178 are met in respect of flood risk elsewhere? What does this mean, given what you've said about the development on the site, etc.?
Well, the pipe represents a 91% reduction compared to the watercourse. So this will significantly restrict the flow of water across this area of land. This worsening of water flow has not been defined within the application information. So we're simply unaware in the information the applicant presents where this displaced water flows and the impact of that. So it hasn't been defined. And it's worth noting that a planning application, there would normally be an expectation for such a significant impact to be accurately defined. And there is a watercourse consent process. The authority require any work to a watercourse to be undertaken. And that ordinary watercourse consent process, which I think I've included in my proof appendix, it was 2 or 3, that hasn't been undertaken.
And so in terms of this issue then, the what it means in terms of flood risk elsewhere, you've taken us to these historic maps in your appendix 10. Can you help us with as insofar as you're able, obviously given what you've said about the information that's been provided for the application, but to give us an idea of where the watercourse previously drained from, insofar as you can see, and what situation is now,
Absolutely.
as you explain in
So,
the evidence.
Inspector, if you were to look again at Appendix 10 of those historic maps, and you'd note that on tile 2 of the OS, so the Ordnance Survey information, there's a clear blue line representing the watercourse. I view that as approximately 150 metres of watercourse running adjacent to the Lydia Park Road that previously drained the surrounding fields. It drained Lydia Park, that has been removed. So the water now that would flow over the greenfield landscape would flow over the Lydia Park area. And previously that would flow over the ground and enter this watercourse. This can no longer occur because the watercourse has been infilled. And I can't see how the surrounding area effectively drains now.
And your 150 metres, is that from the western edge of site A to
Yes.
the eastern point of the
No, I think
access to site?
it's a bit further than that.
Right.
It's to the point of the blue line in tile 2.
But from appeal site A?
Yep, from appeal site A
to where the blue-
towards Lydia Park, that open watercourse is removed.
Right. So okay, thanks.
So
So in respect of then that watercourse, as you've described it across the appeal sites being filled up in the way that you've described, what does that mean then in terms of the water that you've described that can no longer follow its previous course?
yeah, so the water from the rest of this catchment that previously drained to that watercourse, so these are the caravan sites opposite. These are the area of green fields in and around the appeal sites and the appeal sites themselves. So that water can no longer reach and get to that watercourse. So that watercourse, so that water or rainfall now has to flow downhill without the benefit of using the watercourse for conveyance.
And you've described, obviously, you've taken the inspector through the photographs so he can see in some part what happened in November. Do you need to take him to those again, or are you happy that you've shown him those? And
I think what I'd like to have a look at again is the November photographs alongside the EA flood maps. So if we could.
So we've got the EA flood maps in your supplemental proof at pages 6 and 7, 6 being the recent and 7 being the historic. And then we've got the pictures that are shown in your appendix B. Supplemental. The way to remember it, yeah, is the supplementary obviously deals with the new mapping. So that's the one where you find the photographs and things.
So if we look at the new mapping, we'll see that the area.
Just wait for a moment to make sure we've all got the document in front of us. I think with you, your proof is the same within the suite of documents at CD10, where the one looks at A to D, but it's little Roman numeral 1.4, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, far away.
Yeah. So it's going. We can see from the flood maps with the dark blue representing the high risk. That's effectively showing the flow of water. What I note there is that flow of water. So the dark blue isn't shown on the Lydia Park access track. So effectively the water tends to flow in the lower ground north of the Lydia Park access track, flows towards Stovolds Hill. It looks like it floods the Stovolds Hill area of road, and then it flows east. Yep, and now I think if we look at the Appendix B site visit photographs from the 20th to 7th of November. So at page 2, we can clearly see the flooding. There is flooding on the Stoford access track. And there's photographs all the way along the Stovolds Hill access track. And it's worth noting that the development and the infill of the watercourse has prevented the watercourse channeling the water into the lower field area north of the track. Instead, the water now flows along the access track towards Stovolds Hill. This has clearly increased the flood risk for the other occupants of Lydia Park. And specifically referring to 178B regarding increasing flood risk elsewhere, I can clearly see from these photos flood risk elsewhere has been increased as a result of this development and the infilling of the watercourse.
And then just to ensure that you pick up all points, you also within your main proof of evidence have got some figures, and one of those on page 36 of your main proof shows an area of flooded woodland. So I'd like you just to touch on that in terms of this point, which is flooding elsewhere. So your main proof of evidence, page 36, figure 6.
So there's a figure there showing a surface water pond formed on land immediately west of appeal site A. Looking at the Ordnance Survey maps and the topography of the site, there was no pond in this location previously, and there is as part of the development. Flood risk has increased elsewhere in this instance as well.
So that deals, Inspector, with my second issue under the exception test, which is the flooding elsewhere. So can we then just come on to look at the third issue, which is the other limb of 178, which is the safety issue, safe for its lifetime. And can you help us with that then? We've got some comments within the flood risk assessments that have been provided in respect of what the applicants are urged to do in respect of flooding events. And I'd like you to take the inspector through those, please, and help him with what your comments are in terms of the flood risk.
Yeah, so within the under FRA, there are numerous references to chaining down the caravans with anchor points to protect life and stop the development or debris from being washed downstream in times of extreme flooding. I would also note in photo 6 of Appendix B. Yep, of my supplemental. So it's regard to the point, it's relative to the point in the under report regarding debris being washed downstream. So there's a picture there of a timber post and rail fence with missing railing. And I note that any loose materials that could be washed downstream in the event of a flood have the potential to block downstream culverts. For example, wash material from this surface water flood route could potentially flow down to Stovolds Hill and block the road culvert, causing increased flooding to others and increasing the flooding associated with the Stovolds Hill area.
So given what you've said there, and given in the under report, and I think for your note, Inspector, the references that the witness was referring to are on page 30, where I can see that the author of the under report has said in the 8th paragraph down and 9th paragraph down, in the absence of suitable flood modelling with an allowance for climate change, it is recommended that the finished floor levels of the static and touring caravans and day rooms are at least 300 millimetres above adjacent ground level. And then the next paragraph, to stop the caravans from potentially floating away and becoming a debris hazard during an extreme flood event, the caravans will be secured tethered. Now, in terms of what you've explained, both in respect of the photographs that you've showed us and in terms of the changes that have taken place on site, changes in respect of which you've told us on paragraph 29 that the under report urged that the ditch be kept clear of vegetation or debris to ensure it's continually free flowing. So that was how the authors dealt with B to D in that respect. So with that in mind, can you help us with what you consider about the safety position and whether that's adequate for the residents?
I feel the position presented within the under report is inadequate with respect to the safety of the occupants. A strategy of just jacking up a caravan 300 mil and chaining it down, I believe is wholly inadequate, particularly when viewed against the context of the new surface water maps, which show flooding 600 mil or deeper in the area. And this presents a very unsafe situation to the occupants of this development. And I feel that's wholly inadequate. I also note, I think it's at the start of 6.5 of the under report.
So 6.5 on page 25, the flood plan.
Yeah. So it talks about a flood plan. At the end of that sentence, the report says a flood plan, it talks about occupiers and landlords. I don't know why it says landlords. Prepare a flood plan to protect life and property during a flood event. And like I said in my previous point, any development that includes safety measures to protect life should not be permitted.
And in terms of the rainfall event in November 2024 and your categorization of that as a less than a 1 in 2 year event.
Yeah, I look at that and I see kind of a width of floodwater around appeal sites B, C and D. It looks akin to the 1 in 30 event, in that there is a wide corridor of floodwater through there. And I have serious concerns with the drastic reduction in capacity of the water course, that if a 1 in 100 year rainfall event was to happen here, there would be very, very severe consequences to the occupants of this development and also the occupants of the adjoining Lydia Park development. And I cannot see how this development has shown could be shown to be safe.
And you've explained that in the absence of mapping, we don't have an assessment of floodwater depth and velocity. We've got your rebuttal evidence explaining that it would be perhaps somewhere in the region of 600 millimetres to 900 millimetres, but you don't know exactly what that might be. What does that mean in the absence of that information about your ability to gauge the hazard and the effectiveness of any emergency plan in a world in which we found that was acceptable in these circumstances?
Yeah, without a full and proper assessment of both the depth of the floodwater and the velocity, the hazard cannot be determined. So the hazard is a function of the depth and the velocity. That hazard level hasn't been identified in the application information. The flooding for the 1 in 1.6 year event looks quite severe. I cannot see how it can be demonstrated safe.
Now, in your evidence, you give us, in your main proof of evidence, you give us paragraph 44 of the PPG, which talks about the importance of safe evacuation from the site, so from any site. So I'll just ask you, please, to have a look at that part of your main proof of evidence, where you're dealing with paragraph 44 on page 25.
Yeah, so
And just hold on a minute, just while
sorry.
we all turn to that page. And you can see there on page 25, we've got paragraph 44, and you've got two main paragraphs. And after the second one, you've got a series of bullet points where it says the practicality of safe evacuation from an area will depend on, and then the 3 points are made. And the third of those is the adequacy of both evacuation routes and identified places that people from evacuation places places use are taken to. So can you just help us with paragraph 44 and what that means in respect of evacuation, given the location of where the flooding is projected to take place and what you've seen from November last year?
So I've seen from the November photos, there definitely is flooding across this area of the site. The flood maps show a high risk of flooding there with depths in excess of 600 mil. So any development that risks being isolated must have a safe evacuation route. And this is safe access and egress. And this is also highlighted in the current December 24 MPPF, which specifically references safe access and egress routes.
And is that paragraph 175 that you've previously
Yes, it
referred the
is,
inspector
sorry.
to? Okay. All right. So I think, Inspector, that takes us to the end, unless the witness has got anything that I haven't explored with him yet, to the end of the second topic, which is the exception test. I see that we're at 1:05. But my next topic is planning conditions as discussed in Mr. Wood's evidence and Mr. Rowe's evidence. We've got this email that we've received from Peter Brown, John. I'm grateful to my old friend Mr. Masters' indication that that's something that I can talk about with the witness over lunch, and with your permission, Inspector, I will seek to do that. And then I can't say any more about that at the moment because neither of us has seen it, but we can then come back to that topic after lunch if that suits you.
Yes, if you're content to do that and have that discussion. Okay, I'll try and do likewise and have a look at the documents as well. In terms of the conditions Well, I want to make sure that we complete Mr. Smythe today. And I was going, sorry? Yes, I know, yeah. Can you give me estimates that Mr. Cottle and Mr. Masters?
Mr. Masters is going first.
Right.
Obviously, there's a lot of evidence that we've heard,
Yes,
and I will be in the corner for Mr. Simon Doherty on Appeal B.
of course, yes.
And I'm hoping that Mr. Masters will cover most of the general
Yes.
topics. But if I feel that there is something that's omitted,
Oh,
I
yeah,
will
clearly we
raise
agreed,
it.
we agreed that.
But
yes.
I'm hoping to tick off all the points that I've got as Mr. Masters goes through them.
So it's difficult to give an estimate because I don't know how cooperative or evasive Mr. Smythe will be.
No, the reason I'm asking is you're asking for a longer lunch adjournment that we've had, and
But I think my
it's-
estimate originally was about 2 hours.
I've still, you
Until
see,
I got to you,
well, my concern is that we've still got examination in chief to come. You're asking for a longer lunch adjournment, and we're going to have to finish probably around about 5 o'clock.
So it's difficult for us because we end up getting very long. So there we go.
Well,
But
okay.
We always get penalised for making a mistake of going through and cheap. That won't take any time.
Well, I certainly won't comment on that, given the way I think.
Okay, adjourned in a moment. There's just one, I think, point I want to be clear about in terms of what you've said about the flood risk zones. And I think on a couple of occasions you've explained to the inquiry the read across from flood zones 1 to 3B to the surface water level of risk. That's right. You've set that out and I've noted it. Can you just tell me the source of the read across? Yeah, thanks.
PPG, paragraph 23.
So you've got paragraph 23 on page 24 of the witness's evidence in his main proof, Inspector.
So if you were to look at the last sentence of paragraph 23, the guide tells us other forms of flooding need to be treated consistently with river and tidal flooding in mapping probability and assessing vulnerability. So that to me says other forms of flooding, you've got to consider the probability, the vulnerability. It's quite clear.
Yes, it was how which
Oh, it's the read across between the probabilities. It's just published data.
So I think what the inspector is asking you for some clarity on is in terms of the table that you see under your paragraph 4.27, you took the inspector through a definition of probability.
Oh, the
Yeah.
the equivalent definitions for surface water.
Yeah, so with surface water, you've related it to probability in the way that table shows annual probability. Is that what you've done? So is that?
Yes, that's correct.
No, that's, yeah.
I'm just trying to think where. Yep. Is there an equivalent table for the surface water?
Not an equivalent table. It's the sort set very low. Is that just?
It's just the probability. It's the likelihood factor of 1 in 1,000.
Could I just ask for the paragraph that we were just being referred to, because I'm in the main body of the proof and I can see references to the PPG, but I was just wondering where you were reading from just a minute when you were referring to.
So it's
23.
the last three lines of the paragraph 23 on page 24.
Thank you.
Right, so just let me get this clear. The probabilities are the same. That's why you've done the read across. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Inspector, just to be precise, because we've got different clocks saying slightly different things, and
Right.
I can see a clock over there that says it's 13:11, which is
Yes,
slightly
that's what
different
this
from
one
that
says.
one. So when exactly would you like us back after our 45 minutes?
Well, bearing in mind Mr. Master's point, I'll give you 50 minutes.
So that's
2:05.
2:05. Thank you.
Yeah. And when we resume, just to make sure that we do cover it, now that we've already had the break with Mr. Smythe, I'll hear from Councillor Waterson straight to make sure that we do cover that. And Councillor Waterson, have you got some speaking notes or a statement that you wish the inquiry to have?
Yes, I've got a few copies of what I'm supposed to say.
Yeah, that would be helpful. If we could have those at the outset, it will just save us writing everything out. You'll need one, obviously for myself, and then probably two for each of the other parties, probably 6 or 7 to hand out. I'm sure the council can help you if you need a few more. Thank you very much. Right, the inquiry is adjourned. Resume at 2:05, please.
Thank you, Inspector.